My name is Shirley Thiessen. I am a mom who is grieving the death of my 23-year-old son. I am not a journalist, a producer, or even a videographer. However, I felt compelled to create a video that features personal grief stories from people in my faith community. The pain in grief has the potential to make each one of us more lonely or drive us deeper into community. I have personally experienced the value of choosing a community that companions with me in my grief. I'm convinced stories must be shared. The motive behind the stories is to bring hope to those who are bereaved and introduce you to others who understand grief. You are not alone. Without the courageous participants who were vulnerable in sharing their hearts and their stories, there would be no video. These inspiring people, who you'll meet in a moment, are my heroes. I invite you, dear grieving friend, to lean in and listen, and as you do, I trust your heart will be encouraged by the golden threads of hope woven into the fabric of each and every story. Hope is Jesus Christ. He wants to be the hope in your story as well.
My mom, she was sweet, she was gentle, she was patient. She was an example of faith to me, and just somebody who always had time for us kids and made the everyday stuff of life fun, and the kind of person that other people were drawn to. When my mom was 27, around there, she was diagnosed with cancer, and that was right around the time that she found out she was pregnant with my twin brothers as well. So we were living in Germany at the time. The German doctors were advising her to abort the pregnancy. My folks decided, let's come back to home, come to Calgary, and be surrounded by family. So my brothers were delivered prematurely, and they're healthy and well now. And she went through lots of cancer treatment, and through that, along the journey, obviously experienced the very taxing, the toll that treatment takes on a body, and even through that, unfortunately contracted hepatitis C through a tainted blood transfusion, all within this season. Eventually, the cancer went into remission. She had a number of healthy years until roughly age 38 or so, maybe 37. So 10 years later, just her organs were not keeping up the same anymore, and they started to shut down. I was 15. I remember just a day in September, and I was in school in grade 10, sitting in German class, and I hear my name called over the PA system, and I knew what was coming. A couple days earlier, we had gone to the hospital, and we had said our goodbyes, and I knew what was coming. And so I went down to the principal's office, kind of knowing what to expect. My grandma and grandpa were there, and my grandpa said, yeah, your mom's with Jesus. She's with the Lord now.
Brent, I met in college, and we got married in our early 20s. He loved music. We did music together, and he was crazy passionate about hockey and loved to follow the Flames, had season tickets. He also loved humor, loved to make sure everybody was laughing around him. And he was an incredible businessman who worked his way up from a junior clerk to a manager over the course of his entire career. Brent was 52 at the time. He He had been struggling with depression and anxiety for some time, and most people didn't know that. That was a fairly private thing. On December 7th, I got some uniformed officers walking in my office mid-morning on a Friday and let me know that he had passed away, had been killed. He had taken his life by stepping in front of a C train.
She had charisma. She had personality. She had a happy disposition. She was smart. She was beautiful. She was the type of person that when you walked into the room, you wanted her to be your friend. The date was November 20th, 2002. And Tanya's death was originally classified as a suicide, and it was designed to look that way by her husband, who was later charged with strangulation or death by hanging. Right then, the family had a choice to make as far as how we were going to react to that type of news and how we would respond, not only to the public, but to Michel, her husband at that time. And it was through my mother setting a standard for the family, saying, look, this is the way that we're going to approach this. We're going to approach this with love and forgiveness. And so we had that attitude right from the onset. And so even our interaction while he was still free, we knew that the police were pursuing this as a murder. And yet we still tried to show him love and gave him opportunity to confess, and never had any sense of bitterness against him, and that was, I think, key. And so as it went to trial, we had that same attitude to our interviews with the press. They were trying to look for us and sometimes egg us on to have that element of bitterness against him and that hostility, and we weren't going to go down that road. And it made an impact to those who were covering the trial, the newspapers and the television and the other media. God is sovereign. We knew that right from the beginning, even though the circumstances would have us question what God was doing in our lives and why this was all happening to us, and certainly what had happened to Tanya. It left us, after this whole case, still sad and still angry, but comforted. After Tanya's death, we learned more about domestic violence, and we started to do a little bit of reading, because these type of murders happen about 40 times a year, certainly in Montreal or in Quebec. And so we wanted to get a better understanding of what happened, because we really, as a family, we didn't see this type of thing coming. I mean, we didn't see them argue or fight, or you would say, oh no, this is a conflicted couple. We just saw a couple that, disagreed at times, but didn't show an attitude where this type of situation would have been the outcome. And so we became advocates against domestic violence. We became involved with the Sunshine Center. We have a suite there in my sister's name that the family underwrites. But it was in the study of the characteristics of what is commonplace in these relationships really got us thinking, and certainly me, doing an introspective look at our own relationship and recognizing that you're only one bad decision away from a very bad decision. And so when we started to look at areas in our own marriage and areas where we could improve, we started taking marriage enrichment courses and starting to grow our own marriage. And it was through that we thought, we could help others as well. At First Alliance Church, we're involved in the dynamic marriage ministry. That's how we started. About 5 years ago, we started becoming, not only having attended that course, it made such a huge impact on our marriage and on our relationship that we said we need to become trained facilitators.
I was extremely close with my mom, and it was very hard for me when I got married and came to Canada. We were miles apart, thousands of miles apart. So in those days before internet, it was really hard to call her because it was just so expensive. So I would only call her once a month. And when I finally talked to her on the phone, there will be no talk, but just sobs, long sobs. So we would write letters every day, and in those days it was slow mail. So I would receive her mail 3 weeks later, and so we would write every day, not waiting for each other to answer. My mom was diagnosed with lung cancer at age 58, although she never smoked in her life. And 6 months later, she passed away. She went to be with the Lord. The date was May 19, 1996. I missed everything about my mom. I miss her smiles. I miss talking to her. This is tough. I miss her hugs. I miss praying with her. I miss her jokes and her smiles and her jokes and laughters. She laughed at her own jokes a lot. My mom was my closest friend, and Jesus was my closet friend. So every time I need Jesus, I would take him out of the closet to solve my problems and put him back into the closet. After the loss of my mom, I felt extremely lonely. Then I remember my mom's teachings about Jesus Christ. So I knew I had no one to turn to but to him.
He was unique in that he was the loudest of the four. Certainly the most talkative, very funny, brought a lot of laughter into our home, and extremely competitive. Greg was 21 when he passed away. Yeah, so I just miss his loud humor. And I guess the other thing is, he used to, the last few years, he always used to call me Pops for some reason. And, I think as a parent, sometimes you wonder whether your kids like you, because there's often conflict. And I often wondered sometimes if Greg actually liked me, but whenever he called me Pops, I knew, yeah, he likes me. So, well, he passed away from cardiac arrest, sudden cardiac arrest. He had been diagnosed with a heart condition, hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, about 3.5 years earlier. And he was extremely low risk. And I can tell you, I never ever worried about Greg having heart issues and passing away from them, even though we probably should have. But it just wasn't on our radar. And it happened. Not sure why, but it happened. When we met with his cardiologist many months later, he said if he had to pick one of his patients, Greg would have been the last one he would assume this would happen to.
If I were to describe my loved one, I think I would say love of my life, my rock, and this is one phrase, calm and steady. My husband Dale passed away on August 23rd, 1998, of colon cancer. He had been ill for 11 months. That day that he passed away was the day before our 35th wedding anniversary, and he remembered, which totally surprised me. I really miss him, and for 2 reasons. He was my encourager, and I always felt his love around me. Dale's death really affected my life in a big way. When he passed away, I felt that I had lost my identity. I was no longer his wife. I wasn't employed. I had pulled out of a music program at the church that I was very active in. And our social life was pretty well nil because of his illness. And I just felt totally lost. My church contacted me and asked me if I would consider coming on staff in the area of caring ministries. And in my own thinking, I would have never dreamt of doing that. But for some reason, God prompted me to consider it and to pray about it, and I did. And that lasted for 10 years in my life. And the reason that I made that decision was from the scripture in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 3-5, where God talks about being a comfort to us so that we in turn can be a comfort to others. And that's exactly what happened in my life. And I'm so grateful to the Lord for that opportunity because I was able to do that in His strength.
My son Matthew was 22 when he entered Heaven's Gates. He was compassionate. He was a talented, great musician. He loved the outdoors. And one thing that his mother always said, that he was a great hugger. Actually, she even to this day says he's a better hugger than I am. So when Matthew was promoted to heaven, he was working at a oil and gas camp up in Fort McMurray. Matthew had addiction problems, and we know that he was robbed, ran onto a construction site, and fell down an elevator shaft and died at 4:15 on October 13th, 2013. Had our Thanksgiving dinner with my family, proceeded and went to bed. 11 o'clock, the doorbell rang, and the Calgary City Police informed us that our son had passed away on a construction site. And needless to say, life after that has never been the same. It's like there's an emptiness and a loneliness that can never be filled. Matthew was a great musician, and in the early stages of this, the silence in the house was deafening. Yes, there's tears there every day. I find that driving home from work is the hardest for me. Too much time to reflect and too much time to think. I have a picture of Matthew in my visor, and then when it's sunny and I put the visor down, he's just there smiling right at me. So, and that's when the tears just start to flow on knowing what I'm going to miss, because Matthew was our only child. I'll never be a grandfather.
My son Jordan was a thoughtfully attentive son. He expressed gratitude readily. I really appreciate that about him. And he had a great sense of humor. He had us laughing often. My husband and I were just 4 days into our vacation. We received the news over the phone that our newly married 23-year-old son had died in a workplace accident. He had just recently graduated from university. He had found a job in his field in the city we live. He had just married his sweetheart. Everything was going up and to the right. He was so excited about this season of life and all that God had in front of him.
Well, she was my lover for 32 years, and a very big encourager. That was really her whole spirit, very loving, very encouraging spirit. And in spite of all the challenges that she went through for 16 years with her spinal condition, and 12 of those being a paraplegic, she still had the bright side of things as her outlook, and she carried that right through every day and everything she did. We were married 32 years. Our oldest son 29, and he got married just a little over a year ago. And our youngest son 23, and he got married coming up a year ago. So the good news is my wife Leslie was able to be here for their weddings, and that was one of her key goals along the way. Leslie had some surgery in early April. The surgery and the corrective action that they took went quite well, went as planned. Unfortunately, she had quite a number of complications, some small ones initially, but they tended to complicate each other and snowball each other, and she ended up spending the better part of 8 weeks in intensive care. And as I phrase it, she just basically ran out of gas. She was a fighter, rallied towards the end, but unfortunately it just took so much out of her, and it was another little bit of a setback, and it overcame her. She was 1 day before her age of 60. She turned 60, so we still celebrated her 60th birthday a few days later, and we celebrated her life. But as I say, it was the day before her 60th birthday that she passed away.
My daughter, Raylyn, she was 20 months old. And she was just the happiest little girl, just curious, liked to dance in circles, and I loved singing to her, and she just would hum along with me. July 13th, 2002, on a Saturday night, our family decided that we had 3 kids at the time, 4-year-old Justin, 3-year-old Megan, and 20-month-old Raylyn. We decided to go to church on Saturday night, just because we had another little neighborhood girl with us, and we thought, wouldn't it be nice to just attend church on a Saturday night? And I still remember that service to this day. It was very meaningful. At the time, I didn't know how meaningful it was going to be to me. Pastor Ryan was speaking. He was speaking about what is most important in your life. He had us visually write down on a piece of paper an arrow and tried to put things in order about what might get us through during a hard time. What's the most important thing in your life? At that point, he also shared a quote from Johnny Depp, who had said that his daughter was the most important thing in his life, and without his daughter, he would have no reason for living. So then after church, we decided rather than bring this little girl home with us, we would bring her home to her house, just make it easier on her mom. It was a nice day to have a lemonade in the backyard. So we were there about 10 minutes, and there's a lot of things that happened, but at the end of the day, we lost our daughter in a drowning accident in their indoor pool. There was a side door left open. So that was the most devastating day of my life, and at that point, I wasn't sure if I'd ever be happy again.
My son Simon was a very spontaneous, very creative in so many ways, particularly off the wall in his type of humor. I think the whole of the family, we were all grew up on Monty Python, so there were so many times where he would come out with quite outrageous things. Yeah, so it was 13th of May 1991. I think got home at about 4:35, and from what I remember, we immediately had a phone call from Simon's girlfriend, Suzanne, and she was very worried about him, that he had not returned from a trip into the mountains. Soon after that, 2 detectives arrived, and you could just tell by the look on their face that this was not good news. And they said they thought that Simon had died in a car crash in the field area. And it's, I think like most people that go through this, you just feel like you're in a daze. You just can't imagine that this could have happened.
My dad was tender. He was content. He loved his job. He loved coming home. He loved his family. He loved his life. He made it easy for me to relate to God as my father because his faith was so authentic. And I held hands with my dad when we went for walks to the day he died. Debbie was my best friend. Debbie was uncompromisingly loyal, unconditionally accepting, and incredibly thoughtful. She was just an incredibly loving person. Not so much when we were growing up. We fought like most sisters. I think she was about 16 and I was about 12 when she finally figured out I wasn't really all bad, and we started to get along. And by the time she left home to go to college, I bawled for a solid 2 weeks because I hated that she was gone. So Dad was diagnosed with prostate cancer, which nobody really freaks out about because a lot of older men have it, right? But it seems like when we do cancer in our family, it's aggressive. And it wasn't all that long before it was in his bones, which is a horrible, horrible disease. And the whole period was such a fog because there was just so much grief. And both Debbie, my sister, and my dad were going through cancer treatment at the same time. I think Dad was diagnosed first. His journey was about 2 years, I think, and then Debbie was diagnosed. Her journey was only 16 months. Breast cancer that then went into the liver and then the brain. Someone needed to be with Debbie 24/7 at the end because she was at home. And we were her caregivers. And so we took turns sleeping in the same room. She was on a hospital bed, so we had another bed in the room. And Terry and Jocelyn and I took turns being with her all night. And one night I was just laying there listening to her thrash. It was very hard to sleep because she was very agitated. And suddenly the thrashing stopped. Now, Debbie had over 100 tumors in her brain by this point, so she wasn't able to articulate what she wanted or needed. She wasn't usually able to find the right words to say what she needed. She wasn't really fully lucid or fully conscious. And yet suddenly this thrashing stopped and she began to pray, clearly to pray. And in those beautiful moments in the darkness, she told God how much she wanted to honor him with what was left of her life. And it was such a beautiful moment. I could barely breathe. As the soft sheets soaked up my tears, I just wept as I listened to this beautiful expression of her soul, because her brain wasn't really working. And to hear her soul connect with God's soul like that was just incredibly beautiful. I'll never forget it. And it was such a privilege to be at my dad's and then my mother-in-law, Alice Carter's, and then Debbie's bedside as they went into the presence of the Lord. What a privilege.
Might seem funny, but I would send card to my mom at every holiday, her birthday, Valentine's, Easter, Christmas. I would send them to my brother and ask him to get a bunch of flowers and place them on my mom's grave. And that really helped me grieve that very first year without my mom.
If I were to tell you about my first Christmas, I would say it was a bummer. It really was, because I had lost my mother 3 months after Dale, so I was grieving 2 dear people in my life. Our family decided that we were going to have Christmas at my house, and so they came and helped me decorate. They came for Christmas Day, and Christmas came and went, and I was glad it was over with. Well, then the second year came along, and because I thought I had 1 year of experiencing growing in my new life as a single person, I could handle this. It turned out to be pretty disastrous. I decided that I would go ahead and decorate the house despite my kids' offers. I could do it, and it was disaster. And it just made me realize how much I missed Dale. He was such an integral part of Christmas with our family. So I would really encourage people to gather for those occasions. Don't be alone. Don't choose to do it by yourself. Choose to do it with the people you love. And I think you'll find that there is some healing that comes from that.
Our first Christmas, we went back to Newfoundland and spent time with the family. We did place a stocking at the fireplace for Matthew, and what we did ask was all family and friends to send us a memory, or send it to my sister-in-law a memory, which they did, and they placed in a stocking. And on Christmas night, we took the stocking down and we read all the memories. We laughed and cried, but it was a beautiful experience. When we came back from Newfoundland, we walked into my brother-in-law's house in Beaumont, and we sat down, and there was a tree next to the Chesterfield, and Darlene started looking at it. The lights were on. She said, "Is that a Matthew tree?" And my sister-in-law was like, "Yes, mission accomplished." So what she had done was contacted all the uncles and aunts and cousins and asked them if they would send an ornament that reminded them of Matthew, so she could put it on the tree. And none of them got together and planned what they were going to do. And so my sister-in-law said, as the ornaments started coming in, it was a big surprise to her that nothing was the same. She was expecting lots of guitars to come, and like there were birds came in, curling brooms, quads, skidoos, frogs, deer, fish, all kinds of things that Matthew had done. It was a blessing, and they all had attached a little note as to why they sent it. And so to this day, we've kept the tree up. It's in our living room upstairs in the house, and it's a blessing to go over at times when you feel a little lonely. You just go over to the tree and you look at it and you reflect on how much in his short life he touched so many people, and the opportunity we had to have him for 22 years that we were so thankful for.
Well, our very first Christmas without Jordan came up so quickly, only 2 months after his funeral. And my husband and my daughter and I just knew that we didn't have the emotional capacity to hold on to the traditions that we've normally done. We just intuitively knew we had to do something different. And so with the help of some generous friends, we ran away. It was super low-key. We didn't send out Christmas cards. We didn't put up a Christmas tree. We didn't buy gifts. We just were together. It was almost like hunker down and huddle together. Now, we did this with some risk because we knew that it would be profoundly disappointing to our extended family not to show up for Christmas and do our normal family things. But I think one thing I have learned is that there is a need to be a little bit selfish in your grief. You intuitively often know what is helpful and what isn't. And we just knew that, well, first of all, Jordan would be so obviously absent if we did what we always did. But we also just felt like that was all we could manage. And so for people who are particularly good at being people pleasers, it's really difficult to release yourself from others' expectation.
There's one phrase that I think is particularly not helpful that I've heard at some funerals, and it's the kind of thing along the lines of heaven is twice as bright now that they're there, your loved one is there. And maybe it sounds nice to some, but it's really not true. I mean, Jesus' glory is what shines in heaven, and the reward that we get is to be with him. And so anything that points us to who Christ is and glorifies him is helpful. Anything that lifts up our loved one to a position above what it really should be is probably just wrong.
Very, very helpful to me was Grief Share. It was about 9 months later that I took it, and the videos and other stories of those around the table helped me understand that I'm not alone, that this isn't weird, that this process of grief is as unique to me as it is to anyone else, just as much as my fingerprint is unique to me. Going through Grief Share in those 9 weeks was helpful in helping me understand that I hadn't even grieved properly some of my other significant losses. My mother's death when I was 35, my brother's death when I was 16, the death of not one, but 4 nephews and nieces from my big family. And I had never been given permission to grieve. We were a family that just said, well, we don't grieve as others do that have no hope, and we soldier on, and we praise the Lord, and we move forward. And I'm like, I know God is with me, but I needed time to let the emotion run its course, and I still do. Here I am, 3.5 years out, and there are times when I'm still blindsided. So recovery doesn't have a time frame or a deadline, and that's okay. And you take it one day at a time.
We had a friend who didn't speak to us for 2 years after the incident because they didn't know what to say or how to act in front of us. And that was the 2 years of a missed opportunity for both of us, really.
Found it very comforting when friends visited and prayed for me. They said very little. They listened and cried a lot. And they were just hurting with me. So I found that very, very comforting.
There was one book that really resonated with me, and it was called Morning Song, Mourning, and it's written by Joyce Landorf Heatherby. And in that book, I realized that I was very angry with God for taking Dale away from me. And when I realized that, I became feeling very guilty. And that caused me a great deal of stress. But as I read further in that book, I recognized that God knew my pain. He knew where I was at. He understood my anger, and he wasn't upset by it. But he showed me his great love, and it was through his love and his grace that changed my heart.
You know, we got a lot of cards in the mail after Greg passed away. It seemed like for 30 days straight, every day we went to the mailbox, there was cards, stacks of cards. I was amazed at how significant these cards were to us. We read every one of them, and many people just signed their names, some put a personal note, but they were extremely helpful because it just was a message to us that people were thinking about us. So if you don't know what to say, you can easily send a card.
The most helpful thing came from a friend who was not an extremely close friend and not a person of the Christian faith. My friend just said she had been in Europe when the funeral happened, and so she called and invited me over for just a little time, some food and some drink, and to just ask me about my dad. And when I got there, I didn't really know that was her agenda, and I said, "Tell me all about your trip to Europe." And she said, No, that's not what this is about today. This is about you telling me about your dad. I never had the opportunity to know him. I wasn't at the service to hear the story, so I want you to tell me about your dad. And that was such a gift. I was given permission to just brag on my amazing dad. I just talked for hours about my dad, and it was a beautiful gift. And it's really changed the way I am with grieving people now. I don't say, "How are you?" And I've said it, and I know it's a stupid question because you don't even know how you are when you're grieving. You really don't, and it changes every 30 seconds. But to instead say, "Just tell me about your loved one," that's what I do now. And I think it's a beautiful thing to give someone permission to just say everything they want to say, everything that's on their heart about their loved one.
Between age 17 and age 52, my life was great. I was trained as an architect. I had met Jennifer at college. What more could I need? Had a wonderful family, had enough money to, have a reasonably good life. We probably contributed to a lot of causes and did a lot of things that we even do now, but I didn't have any desire or need for anything spiritual. On the following Sunday, I remember being in our bedroom, beautiful day, almost like today, beautiful blue sky, and it was warm, the sun was coming through and it was warm. And I just had a sense of somebody holding me. That's all I can say, no words or anything like that, but I had somebody almost saying, "Be calm, be still, I'm going to look after you." And with that experience, and then obviously meeting with the pastor that had been recommended to us by Simon's girlfriend's mother, I think a series of things started to happen that were somehow part of that process. I mean, I really didn't understand what was going on at the time, but I fondly remember back to that moment. It was certainly life-changing. I do not remember saying to Simon, "I love you." I just don't remember it. If I did, it's been taken out of my memory. And I don't remember hugging him. I just, I think it's part of the British Reserve, rather like when we first joined the small church we joined, to have men come up and hug me was really weird. I just sort of almost wanted to pull back. So, yeah, that just wasn't in my DNA. that has changed in our family. I think soon after that, we're very clear about the fact that we every phone call ends with "I love you," and when we get together, hugging is definitely very important. Yeah. Before Simon died, I don't remember crying. Now, I'm probably worse or better, whichever way you want to call it. I'm quite teary, and honestly, I'm glad.
For me, action spoke louder than words. And so there were two young guys in particular in the youth group, Sterling and John, a year and two ahead of me, who just made it their mission, and not in a way that I was a project, but just in a natural, caring, being who Christ called them to be kind of a way. They just invited me in, they took me under their wing, they made sure that I was okay. They made sure that I had friends around them. They, at the appropriate time, would give me a piece of scripture as encouragement. They would invite me to youth events. They'd pick me up and drop me off again, so there wasn't an extra toll on my dad. And so those two guys in particular really showed Christ to me in those days. We understand in our brokenness that Jesus is our hope. There's an authenticity to our walk and how we've pursued Christ, and there's a realness to how we proclaim Christ as Savior and truly the one that we need to find our identity in, not our grief, not the hard things that we faced in life.
I had waited a full year before I began considering whether I wanted to go into a relationship again, and I chose to go online, and that was a total bomb. I began to pray that God would bring someone into my life that I already knew, or whose life I could validate through mutual friends without having to rely solely on their word for who they were. And this gentleman had been in the church for 10 years. I knew of him. I'd sung with him. And I asked him out to a hockey game, and we had a great time. And 6 months later, we were married. So actually, marrying Henry was part of my recovery journey. It wasn't on a rebound. We both really searched our hearts and asked God to make it clear to us whether this was the right thing for us to do. And he has been such a gift.
There's times when we've struggled, and Darlene has struggled, and I wouldn't know what to say or do. And I'm like, oh God, like, somebody call. Let somebody please phone. And the phone, about an hour or two later, the phone would ring with unexpected people that we haven't heard from in years, with words of encouragement. So, like, the Lord has opened doors and touched us immensely. I don't understand why Matthew went so early. I believe it's God's will. Do I like his will? No. I'll probably understand it when I get to heaven. People ask me what would be the first question I'd ask. I said, I don't know. I won't care what the first question is when I get to heaven. I'd be just so anxious to see Matthew, so anxious to see God, that the cares on here don't matter. And if it wasn't for our faith, I wouldn't be able to get through this, because if we didn't have the hope and belief that there is life after death, and that God is coming back again one day and we're all going to be reunited, I wouldn't be able to get through this, because without hope, you have nothing.
Well, God has certainly shown up in powerful ways in my story, in that I feel like He's allowed me to rant and rave and loved me through that. Reading through the laments in the book of Psalms, I came to realize that He is very comfortable with us just being open about our emotions. I often had days where I fell apart. I would scream and cry, and noises came out of me I didn't even know I was capable of making. And yet in that, I still sensed God's love for me. But I did realize too that it would not be wise to set up my tent and camp there. And so I I felt like God was always welcoming back into his arms and saying, you cried out, but please always remember I love you, and this is not where I want you to stay.
My oldest son has been a huge support for me. We were always close, but he's obviously been affected by the same incident here, and he's been doing his grieving, but he's been reaching out on a daily basis. And, she'd been dealing with a breathing tube for a number of weeks, and they had done some tests to see if she was strong enough to come off that breathing tube on her own, and she wasn't there. And I think at that time that she just sensed it was time. And there was a big decision that had to be made regarding quality of life decision. And who knows if a number of days later I would have had to make a decision to take her off that breathing machine. But I know that would have been her request, because we had talked about that long before she went in for her surgery. And I believe in retrospect, God spared me from having to make that decision and the burden of that decision. So he definitely showed up there. Yeah. And I didn't realize that at the time, but it was a couple of days later that the light went on that.
I mean, I think in some ways in the early days I felt some level of guilt that I had avoided. I had 6 Christians working for me, so it wasn't like I wasn't exposed, but I probably wouldn't have allowed them to even come anywhere near me with any kind of message. So, yeah, I felt some level of guilt in the beginning that, Simon didn't have any encouragement to study this. But over time, I think I've realized that it's not for me to make the decision. And there are so many things that could have been going on in the background. And yeah, I'm reminded often about the thief on the one side of Jesus who, in literally the last seconds of his life, makes the decision to come to Christ, and he gets warmly welcomed. So I don't know what the answer is, and I put total faith in God to work that one out. I no longer feel any guilt about it.
It's been 13 years since we lost our daughter. And at that time, I would have thought I could never have joy again. I thought, this is it, I'm done. Check me out. I'm never going to be happy again. In hindsight, I can say that I've experienced joy. I am happy again. I still think about Raylyn. Our whole family does. So you can find joy again, and you can experience God walking with you through these very difficult moments. We don't know what that's going to look like, but He'll be there.